right. Hello, everyone. My name is Christopher Bellman from Carleton University. I'm a PhD student, and I'm here today to talk to you about the Internet of Things security, IoT, and sort of specifically what a best practice actually means in the context of IoT security. Now, a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about in this talk is widely applicable to other fields. It's not necessarily just about IoT security, and a lot of things can fit into a lot of other places. However, I scope it specifically for IoT security in a number of parts. So just a little bit of background first on some of the issues that we're facing in IoT security. The IoT, sort of the life cycle of IoT, if the manufacturers and any pre-sale stakeholders really, so pre-sale stakeholders being the designers, the manufacturers, the people who are developing the operating systems for these devices, software developers, integrators, really anybody who appears in the life cycle before the user gets their hand on it. They are responsible for early life security. And if the security of a device is weak early on in its life, it accrues something that we're calling security debt. Security debt is very similar to tech debt, which people might be more familiar with. And the idea that if security is sort of not done very well early on in its life, it accrues this debt over time, and then will have to sort of be paid later on in terms of probably security issues down the road, or generally anything sort of related to problems with security. And because of this, unfortunately, IoT products have not always had the greatest reputation for being the most highly secure devices. There's been a number of issues in the past, most notably the Mirai botnet with just the basic issue of default passwords being used across a whole number of devices. And unfortunately, it may seem cheaper for a lot of manufacturers, particularly some of the smaller ones, in the short term to not implement these security features. It's very expensive to implement security features and much more beneficial for their business probably to get the devices just out on the shelf as soon as they can. Now, because of sort of all this and the nature of IoT security, particularly sort of home-based or consumer-grade IoT security, it's the users that are most highly affected by the security debt. They rely on these devices. They put them all over their homes. Sometimes people rely on them sort of day to day for their weather or whatnot. Sometimes they're hooked up to their thermostats, and they actually have a real impact on sort of the environment they live in. So these are need to be taken very seriously. So sort of in conclusion to sort of these problems, what we need is these pre-sale stakeholders. So again, the manufacturers, the developers, the integrators, all these sort of people to develop a stronger security for the devices. Now, that seems very, very easy for me to say, but what tools have we given them to work with? How exactly do we expect them to do this? Well, one thing that we would like them to follow are best practices for security. So the concept of best practices for security are not anything new. People have been talking about best practices forever. That goes on in tech, it goes on in medical, it goes on in business, it goes on basically everywhere. I'm sure everyone's heard of this buzzword. That said, I would be willing to bet that I could take anybody watching this presentation right now and ask them what exactly a best practice is. And basically everyone would have an understanding. Everyone would sort of be able to give me a fairly rough definition of sort of what it means. But I went through about 70 different sort of best practice type documents. And within all these documents, I only found a single definition of what best practice actually is. And this is rather confusing to me since we're using this term so frequently. You'd think that it would be defined more often. So it sort of implies to me that the term best practice is used casually rather than scientifically and exactly sort of what we want it to mean. And even RFC 1818, the IETF's request for comments formal documents, BCP 01, which is the introduction of the best current practices sort of stream of their documents, they don't even define what a best practice is in the document that's supposed to lay out what that document type is. So again, it's very, this use of this phrase is casual, even in the most scientific sense where we want to use it for a very explicit use in these, for example, best current practices documents. So there's this sort of a misconception, or maybe not a misconception, but a lot of people are using this term without formally defining it, which is sort of confusing to us. So because of this, we didn't find any great best practices definitions that we really liked too much. So we wanted to make our own for the purposes of our work here, and hopefully it makes sense. So for a given desired outcome, a best practice is a means intended to achieve that outcome, and that is considered to be at least as good as the best of other broadly considered means to achieve that same outcome. So this is our definition for a best practice, and let's break it down. What exactly does this mean? So we see a best practice sort of has four components, or at least our definition has four components. The first being that it must move us towards our goal. There's no point in having a best practice if we're not going to actually achieve something with it. The second being that it must be an actual action to take. An action being something that will move us towards our goal. So the best practice in general moves us towards it, but an actual best practice has to actually take us towards that goal. Third, it must be equal or better by whatever relevant measure you'd like. Now, relevant measure being if it's more cost effective, better, giving you better security outcomes, however you want to define it, because that's going to differ based on who is establishing a best practice. It must be equal or better than other methods agreed upon by the community. We see best practices being born of consensus within a community. Now, what is a community here in this context? A community could be anywhere that a best practice is being practiced. It could be within an organization, within a department of an organization. Maybe different countries will have different best practices for doing certain things. Maybe it's best practice in one country's hospitals to wash your hands one way, while it might be best practice in another country's hospitals to wash your hand another way. It really depends on the sort of the context and the community that wants to establish a best practice. So there's a couple of sort of key points within this definition that sort of pop up. The idea of outcomes and actions. And more specifically, we want to talk about the idea that outcomes are not the same thing as actions, and they're very different concepts. So to break that down here a little bit, an outcome we define as the end goal a stakeholder wants to reach. So some examples of this, very basic examples: have clean hands. Say I want to eat food or touch my face or whatever. I want to make sure I have clean hands. That's a goal I want to reach. Another example: securely store user passwords. A fairly honorable thing to want in your system. Or finally, for users, have a strong login password. If you're going to log into a web service, you want to have your strong password so it's less easy to break into from an attack or something. All of these have sort of a couple things in common. One, they're fairly ambiguous. Exactly how do we sort of reach these goals? What do these goals mean? They're both ambiguous and sort of vague. Securely store user passwords. Well, what does that mean? Where am I storing them? How am I storing them? Exactly what means am I going to do this? So outcomes, they're an honorable thing to have, and we need to have outcomes to talk about what we want to have accomplished in our system. But they're not how we get there. And this is sort of the problem that we see. Opposite of this is the idea of actions. Actions are what we define as a technical means by which to reach an outcome. So to match up with the outcomes from above, a couple of actions: scrub your hands with antibacterial soap and water for 20 seconds. That might be a way to have clean hands. Use SHA-256 for hashing of a user password with a 32-bit random salt. Might be one action you could take towards the goal of securely storing user passwords. Actions tend to have the sort of properties. They're much more specific. They tell you exactly what you want to do, and they're clear. We can understand what they want. There's no ambiguity there, and they are things that we can put in place to reach outcomes. Third, and some of the final property of an action. This is important, and keep in mind this phrase, this term: actionable. Actions must be actionable, and I'll get to what that means in just a second. These actions that I've listed here are not necessarily the only actions that we would take to reach one of those goals up above. For example, scrubbing your hands with antibacterial soap and water for 20 seconds. That might be an action to take towards have clean hands, but are we going to consider drying your hands? Are we going to consider the different types of soap that we want? So this sort of suggests that there are multiple actions that could be taken to an outcome. Any outcome might have one or more actions sort of associated with it in order to reach it. So back on the topic of actionable practices. We define actionable as involving a known, unambiguous sequence of steps, and it is known how to do them, the steps. This means that in order for practice to be actionable, we have to actually know how to do it. We have to know sort of the steps. We have to know exactly how to do those steps, and it has to sort of make sense to us, or else we can't implement it. If we compare this sort of definition against outcomes, we see then that outcomes are not actionable. An outcome, have clean hands, does not have a clear sequence of steps, and we don't know exactly how to do that just based on looking at the text. I mean, it's pretty realistic to know that we all know how to wash our hands or have clean hands, but the text itself doesn't have that. And if we were to give that text, that item of advice, to somebody else, we can't make the assumption that they would know how to follow those steps. Sort of on the contrary of this, best practices, sort of the opposite of outcomes, outcomes being what we want to reach, and best practices being the best way to reach them, they must be actionable, else they're not really a practice. If we suggest that an item is a best practice, it must be actionable, or else we just don't know how to actually do that practice. Therefore, it can't be a practice in the first place, let alone a best practice. So when we talk about implementing these outcomes and best practices, we don't want to be implementing outcomes, because if we try to implement outcomes, we then have to use these ambiguous methods, these very unclear, there's no steps, which then leads to different deployments. A number of organizations trying to implement an outcome, the same outcome, might reach the same outcome eventually, but they'll be doing it likely in different ways. Therefore, they might have different implementations. Some might be better than others. Some might be sort of weaker. Some might be stronger. Some might cost more. Some might cost less. We consider this to be a bad thing, where all organizations are trying to follow these same sort of recommendations, but are reaching it in different sort of ways. And they're essentially achieving different outcomes while it seems like they are achieving the same thing. We consider this a bad thing because ideally we want everyone to be following the same best practices as they are what the community would consider to be the best practices. So we want everyone to achieve that in the same way. Opposite that, trying to implement practices, if we try to actually take a practice rather than an outcome and implement it, this is much different. We have very clear methods to do it. We have a sequence of steps, perhaps a number of actions that show us exactly what we need to do. And if we can all follow those steps the same way, we all use the same technology, terminology, techniques, those will eventually lead us to having the same deployments. Therefore, we're all following the best practices in the same way. So if anything gets updated later on, we can update our best practices and we can all continue to be the most secure that we can across the board. This also has the added benefit of sort of increasing the scope of our community. If we consider best practices to be great across a number of different communities and we can agree on those, then that means we're all having the same deployments across an even larger set of people, which is we consider to be very useful. So this sort of begs the question, what advice are people actually giving for IoT security? What advice are academics, industrial organizations, governments even actually giving for us to, or manufacturers to implement out in the real world to try to make their devices more secure? And arguably the more important question, are the things that they're recommending actually actionable based on our definition? Can somebody take those things that they're given and actually implement them in their devices for consumers to make use of? So we stumbled across these couple of documents from the United Kingdom's Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS. And what they are is the one document is at least a significant listing of 1,000 plus recommendations, guidance, standards, best practices, all these sorts of documents that outline recommendations for IoT device manufacturers and service providers to implement to make their devices more secure. And so after we reduced this list down to only the unique practices, we removed explicit duplicates, we landed at about 1,014 items from 69 different documents and 49 different organizations. Now, these organizations are from, again, governments, they're from industry, they're from a whole wide range of people that recommend things for IoT security. And following our sort of definitions above, we wanted to take a fairly broad look, very macro look at sort of what exactly people are recommending. So we broke it down into two categorizations. We took each item of these and we classified them as either a practice, which is actionable, or an outcome, which is not actionable. We further subclassified the outcomes to go a little bit deeper into what exactly an outcome is to two different types. A type S outcome, which is a type specific outcome. So an outcome that is slightly more specific and sort of implies practices or implies directions to take, but aren't quite practices. And then type V outcomes, which are type vague outcomes. These are more outcomes that are more vague. We don't exactly know how to reach them, and they don't seem to imply any actions for us to take. So sort of following this breakdown, in the top left image here, we can see stacking up all of the different numbers of outcomes and practices for each major phase of the life cycle, as you can see on the right there, we found that the overwhelming majority of these items need to actually be done during the creation phase. And more so, we found that an overwhelming majority are actually not practices at all. They're not things, these recommendations aren't things that manufacturers can actually do for their products very easily. We don't know, they're not actionable. So we can see that only about 9% of all of these 1,014 items are actually, we would define based on our definition, as a practice. 70% of all of the items exist during the creation phase. Again, highlighting the thing that we showed up on our first slide, that it's the responsibility, primarily the responsibility of the manufacturers and pre-sale stakeholders to actually implement these practices. It's, as we can see, such a heavy implementation burden on the upper parts of the life cycle. Down towards the users, there are far fewer, and even the items that would be implemented down during the install, the usage, decommissioning phase, generally aren't practices that the user would even have a hand in. They're still done by some other more technically inclined stakeholder. So it sort of gives us a sense that the life cycle is very top heavy in terms of recommendations and things that need to be implemented by the manufacturers. And we see that this is fairly serious, especially when we consider the recommendations aren't actually, for the most part, things that a manufacturer would necessarily know how to implement in the first place. They're not actionable recommendations. And we see this as a fairly significant issue. So sort of to wrap up a little bit here, to sort of conclude a few conclusions here. One, pre-sale stakeholders, so again, the manufacturers, developers, integrators, anybody that exists before a product is sold to a user, they have the greatest responsibility for security. If they don't do the greatest security up in the early phases, we accrue security debt, and that is bad for a product going farther as it becomes, or it is more weaker in terms of security and might impact the users down the road. Now, how do they improve security? What tools have we given them to actually improve the security of their devices? Well, ideally, we would have them follow sort of well-established community-based best practices. So what are exactly best practices? Sort of summarizing what we've had from earlier in the talk. Best practices are born of consensus. They're community established. A best practice is born when a group of people within any given community come up with a number of practices and establish one or two or however many as sort of being the best practices that they could follow to achieve some outcome. And primarily, best practices are actionable. If a practice isn't actionable, meaning that we actually know how to do it, we can't actually implement it at all. Therefore, it can't be a best practice. So this is a crucial requirement for any practice, let alone a best practice. We have to be able to actually do what we want to do in order to improve our security. And this is critical for manufacturers. Now, that comes to number 4. What are the problems with all these existing recommendations that we took a look at? Well, most of them, 91%, aren't actually actionable. Some get close to sort of suggest what we should be doing. But if they're not actually things that we can take action on, if we know how to do them explicitly just by looking at them, they're not things that we should be recommending to manufacturers to tell them to do. Again, things that aren't actionable, we might be passing around, and people might be able to implement certain features to try to reach a goal. But if we're all doing it in different ways, then we leave potential gaps across an entire industry of IoT devices. And this is rather worrying for us. So sort of, what is the goal we're trying to reach with this? We want to reach better security outcomes by following actionable best practices. We want our outcomes to make sense, and we want solid best practices to achieve those outcomes. So thank you guys very much for attending this talk. I appreciate it. My name is Christopher Bellman. I'm a PhD student at Carleton University, and thank you very much for being here.